The Awareness Revolution Podcast, where we bring you alternative views on big topics that affect just about everyone. If you want to improve your life and change the world, then stay tuned. You'll hear cutting-edge health, financial, and personal development strategies from a revolutionary perspective. Warning: listening may take you outside your comfort zone, separate you from the pack, and change the way you see the world. Here's your host, Jeremy Kinney.
We're here at Anarchapulco 2019, and got a wonderful guest. This is going to be different because this guy understands crypto from a technical perspective, so I wanted to bring him on, pick his brain, because I've been wanting to basically do it for a while. And I figured that there's many other people that would like to as well. So, first of all, thanks for agreeing to do the interview.
Yeah, thank you.
Would you mind just starting off by telling people who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is Chris Pacia. I'm a developer on a project called OpenBazaar. OpenBazaar is a kind of a decentralized e-commerce marketplace, kind of like eBay, but it's a peer-to-peer network. I'm also a Bitcoin Cash protocol developer. I work on Bitcoin Cash stuff in my spare time mostly.
That's awesome. So obviously you do it in your spare time because you're passionate about it. You really believe in the project in particular and crypto in general, I'm guessing.
Yep.
That's awesome. So I know that you're a speaker here. That's awesome. So I'm curious what your talk was about.
Yeah, so my talk was kind of mostly from the Bitcoin Cash perspective. We had this kind of crazy event in Bitcoin Cash last year where there's this guy named Craig Wright who is going around claiming that he's Satoshi Nakamoto, the person who created Bitcoin. Most people think he's full of shit. I tend to think he's full of shit. I spent a good deal of time in the talk going through that. But basically last year he tried to essentially do like a hostile takeover of Bitcoin Cash. He tried to centralize it under his control. And so I just kind of went through, what led up to that and, how it ended up playing out. I mean, ultimately we had this big, we called it a hash war, and ultimately we won and he lost and was unsuccessful, but it's a pretty interesting story.
So that was your talk. You were telling the story of how that all happened and everything. Yeah, it's funny. I hadn't heard about that. So
yeah. They'll probably put the talk online at some point. It'd probably be interesting to check out.
Was it on the main stage?
Cryptocurrencies stage.
Okay, that's right. That's right. Cool. Okay, so one of the questions that I always wanted to ask someone that actually knows enough about the programming language and basically how a blockchain is built. The first main thing is this is a lot of the people that are on the fence with crypto, that they want to like it, they want to believe in it, but they're just so skeptical of government and they think that it's just some sort of government created technology to trick us into some cashless society, basically. Mm-hmm. So I guess my question is, what do you think the chances are, or is it possible that there's some sort of backdoor in the code that the other software developers are overlooking, and that may give it some unknown use in the future that could actually be used to oppress us as opposed to make us free?
In that context, I really don't think there is. There's the actual code is pretty thoroughly peer-reviewed. It's been strongly peer-reviewed for almost a decade now. A lot of people looking at it, a lot of eyes looking at it, and I don't think there's really anything that someone could do to just make it behave fundamentally differently than it's supposed to. There's maybe some, and I don't want to say concern about, but the only place I could think of where there could be anything remotely related to backdoors is with some of the parameters for the elliptic curves that are used in the cryptography. But even that has been going pretty rock steady for the last decade. I think that's pretty heavily peer reviewed. It's over my head to the ability to actually kind of review that stuff, the cryptography part of it. But if something did go wrong in that, it isn't like you wouldn't be able to like take over the system. Like instead, what would happen is potentially it would allow people to spend other people's bitcoins. But if that were to happen, very quickly the developers would swap out the existing algorithms for alternatives and try and find ways to mitigate that problem. So I don't think it's something that like the worst case scenario is like the system stops functioning. I don't think the worst case scenario is that it gets like repurposed for some other like nefarious purpose.
Cool. Yeah, that's gonna help make a lot of people more comfortable with it, which is great. So, I really believe it has a huge potential for humanity in so many different ways, which is why it's one of the things that I cover within the awareness revolution. And people still aren't aware of it. Some of the people that are, they have the concerns, which is why I ask. But then a lot of people they don't know. So I know that we have a long way to go before we reach mass adoption. So I'm wondering, I think awareness is a big part of it. It's hard to understand, so it's hard to explain to others. But from a technical perspective, what do you think is lacking? Because I don't know about programming code. It just seems like we just need to get enough guys together to program code, and it should be scalable. But assuming if that's even the biggest hurdle we have. But so I guess, what do you think the biggest hurdle we have technology-wise? Why? Because I know it's still in its infancy. What do you think the biggest hurdle is, and like how we can overcome it, or how long do you think we're going to take to overcome it?
Well, so from a technical perspective, there's definitely, I would maybe say, 3 areas that we can improve on. Bitcoin's not horrible in these 3 areas, but it certainly could use improvement. One is, as you mentioned, scalability. We can scale it to fairly large sizes today, maybe like Visa scale, and still have it remain relatively decentralized. If you start wanting to go to like global adoption scale, it's going to require some pretty serious changes to how the protocol functions that we don't, this is still a bit researchy, and we don't really maybe have a full idea of how to get there. So scalability is one improvement, privacy is the other. There are some coins that are experimenting with improved privacy, like Monero, Zcash. There's another one now called Grin, is a little bit more private. So there's some advancements going on in privacy technology, but all of them to date kind of come at the expense of the first part, which is scalability. That when you layer on these additional privacy techniques, it tends to make the system even less scalable than it already is. So there's an antagonism there. So if we could kind of resolve that antagonism and scale it in ways that don't, or create privacy technologies that don't harm the scalability of the system, that would be ideal. And then the last one is maybe related to like the security part of it. So Bitcoin has been going pretty strong for 10 years now, but there's perpetual concern that the mining aspect of it might be too centralized, and it may be easy to kind of shut down the system if the mining is too centralized. And we kind of saw this a little bit with my talk with Bitcoin Cash. Part of the reason why this Craig Wright even came close to taking over Bitcoin Cash is because the security of the mining was not as strong as it otherwise we'd like it to be. So improving security in that area is probably the other. So I think those are like the 3 main technical things that could be improved. The other one is just the user experience, but that's more up, not at like the protocol level. It's people building like applications and stuff.
Well, I think the first main use for crypto will likely be as a means of exchange, since that's what Bitcoin was created to be, and that's how people see it. Mm-hmm. But I know Bitcoin took a little bit of a different direction more towards being a store of value. So, which crypto do you think would be the most likely to become the means of exchange for something as small as lunch, and why?
Yeah. I don't know. So it's hard to say. Like, there's Bitcoin definitely has like a network effect to it, which I think is why it still remains number one. I think there's quite a few people don't agree with the direction that Bitcoin is going, and there's enough people. I would say there's enough people who don't agree with it that it would make me question why Bitcoin is still number one. But I think it's largely due to the strong network effect that it has. So it may ultimately, at the end of the day, it may be Bitcoin just for the sake of it was first, it has the strongest network effect, and what have you. Or it could maybe be something else comes along. I don't really know. I work on Bitcoin Cash because, I find I don't know. I find it to be like these problems are like engineering problems, and I have fun like solving them. And so I think we can get Bitcoin Cash to a point where it's functioning really, really well for that purpose. But is that enough to overcome, let's say, Bitcoin's and BTC's network effect? Maybe not, right? So it's just kind of, we have to see how things play out, I guess.
So, okay, so we were just talking about scalability, and you're saying we might have a little trouble making it completely scalable all over the globe. But what if it isn't just one coin that's a means of exchange? Do you think that since we could use multiple coins, that if they were to be somewhat more even, where we're actually using them all, wouldn't that be able to allow us to do far more transactions because we're not relying on one single?
Yeah, that's one way to do it. That's kind of a form of, they call it sharding. It's like you're just splitting the transaction volume across multiple chains. So, I mean, you could almost imagine if you had geographical coins, one coin for Asia, one for North America. Like, if you split the transaction volume across these chains, it's the chains can, it's more easy to handle the load. The question then becomes switching in and out between, you're doing cross-border transactions or cross-chain transactions is where things start to get a little bit tricky, but potentially feasible. And that's kind of along the lines of where a lot of the scalability solutions are going, where it's kind of like a sharded system like that, where not everyone validates the full blockchain, but they validate parts of it, and there's some interoperability there between these different shards. So I think you're kind of hinting at like what is part of the scaling solution, but it's still fairly technical, and I don't know if we know how to do it really well at this point.
What do you think the most exciting thing in crypto is right now?
The most exciting thing. I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, certainly the most hyped thing, I think, is the Lightning Network on Bitcoin, but is that going to play out? I don't know. I guess we'll see. I mean, it's starting to get a lot of press, and people are starting to play around with it, but I think we'll have a better idea of how well it's going to work, in the next year or two. Other than that, I still think we're kind of targeting, money as like the main application for this stuff. We've seen a lot of other applications, people building a lot of other things on the blockchain, and we haven't had anything like really take off yet, right? There hasn't been any like killer app that's done really well, other than maybe the trading assets, store of value type deal is the thing that has kind of done the best so far.
Crypto kitties, which doesn't
doesn't
really help us much.
I don't know how to count that.
But so just in case, I'd imagine a lot of people watching really don't even understand the Lightning Network.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe could you? I know it's complicated, but like maybe kind of explain why it's like what it is and just why it's on a lot of people's radar as far as being the next big thing to happen.
Yeah, so like one of the scaling debates, so this was ultimately the source of the debate. There was a 3-4 year long debate in the Bitcoin community over how best to scale Bitcoin. And the result of that split, essentially there were irreconcilable differences between different groups of people. I was probably on one side of the debate. And the end result of that was the community split and essentially the coin split, the chain split, that Bitcoin Cash essentially split off from Bitcoin as a result of this community dispute. And so the Bitcoin core side, their kind of vision for Bitcoin is where Bitcoin itself is transformed into a system, into basically a settlement system where transactions tend to be very slow and very expensive, which is kind of the opposite of how Bitcoin historically functioned. Bitcoin was always cheap and fast. And so to see this, it's a pretty radical transformation that the core developers wanted to take Bitcoin into, to transform it into something that's slow and expensive. But the idea is that you can then build sort of like payment type systems on top of it that can potentially be cheaper and faster. And so, one example, it's not a great example, but one way you could do this is to build kind of a custodial banking system on top of the chain where we deposit money into a bank account. And you can imagine two people have coins in the same bank at the same bank, or me and you have coins at a bank account at the same bank. If I want to send you a payment, the bank never actually broadcasts the transaction to the Bitcoin network. Instead, they just reduce my balance and increase your balance. So that's what's called like an off-chain transaction. The transaction never actually hits the blockchain. And then you can imagine some kind of interbank clearing system that the banks could use to send payments between banks without going on the chain either. So that's one way you could do off-chain payments. The downside of that is it's a custodial system where I have to give up control of my coins to the bank. The Lightning Network attempts to kind of do the same thing, but without giving up control of your coins. So it tends to be kind of like a non-custodial system where the individual user retains control of their own coins and their own keys, but the bulk of the transactions are done off-chain, and there's some periodic settlement that's done on-chain. Now, it's, in my opinion, like they're constructing a huge Rube Goldberg machine to make this work. So like under the hood, it's insanely complex, the code and the protocol to try and make this work. And it's not clear, I think at this point, if it's going to be reliable enough for various technical reasons of the way payments have to move from hop to hop. Is it going to be reliable enough to where payments can go through whenever you want them? What's the network topology going to look like? Is it going to be very distributed and peer-to-peer, or is it going to be more centralized around a couple large-scale payment hubs and this sort of stuff? And these are like unanswered questions that we'll get more answers to going forward.
That's a really good explanation, and probably the shortest, most simple explanation that I've heard. So that was really good. Okay, so what do you think about? Because I know it's not just the Bitcoin that's working on Lightning Network, but the Litecoin Foundation is also working on building a Lightning Network. Are you familiar with maybe the differences between the two, and maybe the difference in the direction that they're going with it, or the difference in how far along they are into implementing it and to where a lot of people are actually using it?
Well, so I'm not too familiar with the differences, but I do know that historically Litecoin, like the development model for Litecoin has mostly been to copy and paste the code from Bitcoin. So in fact, Litecoin was started as kind of a copy and paste of Bitcoin. They took the code, copied it, pasted it, and changed like two tiny variables and called it Litecoin. And really from that day forward, all the development on Litecoin has been every time the Bitcoin developers make a change to Bitcoin, they just copy and paste that change into Litecoin. So I kind of assume that the Lightning Network on Litecoin is going to be like a copy and paste of the Lightning Network on Bitcoin. Now, there are some other people working on different variants of this. So like Ethereum, I think there are people on Ethereum working on an Ethereum version of the Lightning Network that I think does work fundamentally differently than the Lightning Network on Bitcoin and maybe Litecoin. But I think like from a technical perspective, I think from a high level perspective, I think it's mostly going to operate the same. It's just technically maybe a little different under the hood because Ethereum works different than Bitcoin.
Right. So just for the people that are listening out there, because you're mentioning Bitcoin Cash and we're talking about Bitcoin and Litecoin, Lightning Network. So Bitcoin Cash took a different approach into increasing the block sizes as a way of keeping the transactions fast and cheap like Bitcoin was originally before a lot of people started adopting it and using it, right?
That's accurate. I would also point out that I think a lot of the arguments that the Bitcoin core developers made against increasing the block size they're not necessarily wrong. Well, I think, in my opinion, they were wrong. Like, the size of the blocks on Bitcoin Cash today is not really a threat to decentralization. So the argument was if you increase the block size, you're potentially going to increase centralization on the network. It'll cost more money to run a node and this sort of thing.
But isn't that what happened to Bitcoin, though?
Well, the cost to run a node didn't go up, but the transaction fees did go up. So that's.
Well, I'm sorry to cut you off. I think like the miners got a lot bigger, so that gave them more control, and that's how they were able to change the direction of Bitcoin. Wouldn't that be? Because it could have been a big percentage of people that were buying Bitcoin or owning Bitcoin or using Bitcoin. It was probably a small percentage of people that were able to steer the ship, so to speak, right?
Yeah, I don't think it was the miners. I think it was more the developers. Part of what made it a little bit easier for them to do that on Bitcoin is that Bitcoin had an original hard-coded block size limit in it, hard-coded at 1 megabyte that was put in by Satoshi. And so they just argued not to change it. So they didn't. So it's weird in that they were kind of changing Bitcoin by not changing Bitcoin, right? By like doing nothing as the network came under higher load, as more people used it, simply by doing nothing, it caused the properties to change.
And wasn't the idea for it to change, because it was mentioned in the white paper to increase the block size when necessary? I haven't read the white paper, so it's kind of a question.
Not the white paper, but Satoshi did mention that more or less. We'll just increase the block size when it's necessary. But there is a genuine concern about increasing the block size causing centralization pressure, but not really at the block sizes that we're likely to see anytime soon. It's when we start getting like close to Visa scale and this sort of stuff. Like, I think we can probably handle PayPal scale without it affecting decentralization really at all. But once you start getting like close to Visa scale and beyond Visa scale, you start worrying that the increasing cost of running a node may start creating some centralization pressure. So I think the Bitcoin Cash perspective on this is to let's make the changes necessary to the protocol so that we can try and scale while remaining decentralized. So I think our focus in Bitcoin Cash is very much like an engineering focus on how to optimize this thing so that we can retain the properties that we want, including decentralization, while still scaling it. It's like an engineering challenge, and that's kind of So whereas the Bitcoin Cash developers are kind of saying like, look, we're up for the challenge, we're willing to kind of make the changes necessary to do this, the Bitcoin core developers were saying kind of like, our vision for Bitcoin is we never make those type of changes, right? Bitcoin is more or less like locked in stone, and it just needs to remain locked in stone, like the protocol. And so that's kind of a big difference in philosophy between Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash.
So going back to what you said about Litecoin being a copy and paste almost completely of the Bitcoin blockchain, so doesn't that mean virtually anyone can copy and paste and create their own crypto?
Yeah, and I think really like kind of the only reason Litecoin's still where it is because it was first, right? So it was like Charlie Lee was the first one to do like copy and paste, and he made a lot of money, and a lot of other people said, hey, maybe I can make a lot of money by doing the same thing. So many people put out their own very similar coins, but every subsequent one, it was like worth like exponentially less, than the original copy and paste. So
until they were eventually worthless.
Yeah, so it's weird. It's like, it's almost kind of like artwork, like you got Jackson Pollock drips a bunch of paint on a painting and it's worth like millions of dollars, but like I could do the exact same thing and it's worth zero. It's because he was the one who came up with the idea to do it. So it's like there's value there, I guess, in being first, which is essentially what Litecoin was. All the subsequent people who follow behind and do the same thing, it's just going to be worth less and less and less.
Right. Well, even Bitcoin being the first, it has a huge dominance.
Yeah.
And it always has. So I think it'll be interesting to see if and when they lose their dominance, because it's such a high percentage for dominance right now.
Yeah, and we saw this too so when Bitcoin Cash forked off and split off of Bitcoin, it was the first one to do so. Everyone a lot of people looked at that and were like, wow, look, Bitcoin Cash actually has like a high valuation. Maybe I can do the same thing and make some money that way. So you just saw this huge rush of people to try and follow in Bitcoin Cash footsteps and try and fork off of Bitcoin. But every one after Bitcoin Cash was just worth less and less and less and less. Until like if you do that today and you fork Bitcoin, like nobody cares. But I think it was Bitcoin Cash, and then it was like Bitcoin Gold and like Bitcoin Diamond.
Right,
and
right. I started seeing them pop up. I haven't even looked into them, but yeah.
Yeah, it was just like a gold rush to try and everyone's just trying to make a quick buck, that sort of thing.
Well, before we go, why don't you go ahead and tell people if I missed anything that you'd like to tell them, go ahead, and if not, just give them an idea of where they can find you online so they can keep up with you or learn more from you or whatever.
You could find me on Twitter. I'm pretty active talking about like cryptocurrency stuff on Twitter. My handle is @ChrisPacia, Pacia. You can check out our company's website, OpenBazaar.org. You can download OpenBazaar from there, try it out, play around with it, and maybe list some stuff for sale or buy some things.
Awesome. That's awesome. Cool. Thanks a lot, man.
Yeah. Thank you.